CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The Johannesburg summit of FOCAC held 3 years ago was a big success. China and Africa established the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. President Xi announced the 10 points of cooperation with Africa at the summit, and good progress has been made across the board in speeding up investment, industrialization, and the development capacity of many African countries, including Rwanda.
China is speeding up its comprehensive cooperation with Africa and supports the continent's pursuit of independent development. That's according to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, Wang Yi continued a more than 20-year tradition this week by making Africa his first international trip of the year when he visited Rwanda, Angola, Gabon, and Sao Tome and Principe. According to the Foreign Ministry, the aim of Wang Yi's 2018 visit was to promote political mutual trust, strengthen mutually beneficial cooperation, and prepare for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, which will be hosted by China later this year. So in the build-up to that summit, what further developments can be expected in the relationship between China and the continent? And what were the core outcomes of Wang Yi's visit to Africa this year? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. China's foreign ministers have always chosen Africa as their first trip in the new year. And Wang Yi's continuation of this tradition shows that China consistently pays great attention to China-Africa ties. Now, the foreign minister officially started his African tour in Kigali last Friday, where he told Rwandan President Paul Kagame that China stands ready to help the country in its development agenda. And later, Libreville, he reiterated China's support for Gabon's efforts to transform its resources into economic benefits and play a more active role in African affairs. Let's take a look at some more highlights from Wang Yi's trip.
Promising a continuous tight friendship, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's first foreign visit in the new year once again was to African nation. Visiting the continent has become a tradition, and this time, many agreements were made during Wang's visit to Rwanda, Angola, Gabon, and Sao Tome and Principe. Discussions between China and Rwanda focused on the upcoming China-Africa Cooperation Forum to be held in Beijing later this year. Rwanda called on China for more support and expertise as it aims to become a middle-income country by 2020.
Rwanda has its 2020 vision and its 2050 development plan, and these plans dovetail with China's development plans in many areas. China stands ready to be a long-time and trustworthy partner for Rwanda in its development plan.
China is a very special partner of Rwanda. We have worked together very well in many aspects of the development of this country. Many people in this country are aware of what China is doing in terms of its cooperation with Rwanda in the areas of infrastructure, mainly in the areas of health, of industrialization.
In Angola, Wang called for a transformation and upgrade in their cooperation for common development.
After Angola achieved internal peace, it needed to rebuild its economy and therefore needed a lot of financing. Back then, we noticed many capable countries didn't respond to Angola's urgent need, whereas China, as a good and old friend of Angola, provided assistance despite being a developing country.
Wang said China's financing to African countries is in response to their demands for self-development, as he refuted claims that Chinese financing to African countries had increased their debt burden. Angola thanked China for its tremendous support in peace and reconstruction after the war, and expressed willingness to improve its business environment so as to welcome more Chinese investment in various sectors. Wang also paid a visit to Gabon, where its president expressed hope that China will continue to support his country's development. Wang said China supports Gabon's efforts in transforming its resources into economic benefits and in playing a more active role in Africa's regional affairs. The foreign minister concluded his African tour in Sao Tome and Principe. Before Wang's tour, the foreign ministry said the comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership between China and Africa saw a sound and smooth development in 2017. It also said international cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative made early gains in Africa, and the concept of win-win cooperation and common development enjoyed popular support. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN.
Well, a major focus of this year's trip was to lay the groundwork for preparation for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit to be held in Beijing later this year. A platform established by China and friendly African countries for collective consultation and dialogue, and as a cooperation mechanism among developing countries. In Dakar, CGTN's Desiree Cannon sat down with an expert to describe what is at stake in Wang Yi's current tour, as well as China's contribution to both Senegal as well as the continent's development.
Mr. Ali Mbai, the Chinese foreign minister, started his African tour on the 12th of January. This visit is an opportunity to discuss the cooperation between China and Africa. As analysts familiar with Africa-China cooperation, what do you think is at stake in this visit of the Chinese diplomat?
China is part of the countries that are driving growth at world level. The model of cooperation we have had with traditional donors is not very much effective, as several studies have shown. The problem of lack of effectiveness of aid is now widely documented, and you have a near consensus that traditional aid has not been very effective. With China, you have very quick responsiveness. When the president of Guinea needed the grid, the electricity grid in the country to be upgraded, China could respond faster than everybody else, and they ended up doing that. And in several areas of infrastructure building, you can observe the same reaction. So African countries are increasingly turning to China when they need infrastructure to be set up and in short period of time. And to jumpstart growth, infrastructure is key. That's why Senegal, like other African countries, are very much interested in developing their partnership with China in this area. I think China can offer many things. One is financing, because accessing financing is challenging for most developing countries, in particular African countries, because they are not eligible for many private sources. And if you look at traditional sources, usually you have some strings attached to them in terms of governance and in terms of many other conditionalities traditional donors are putting on aid to Africa. While Chinese assistance used to be very fast and doesn't consider all these issues regarding governance and the like. So accessing Chinese finance is usually much easier than traditional routes to access financing available at international level. This is number one. Number two is infrastructure. Infrastructure is key to jump-starting development. And China is here to build infrastructure, electricity, roads, bridges, and the like. And usually bringing the financing of such infrastructure at the same time. I think this also is important.
We hope that by China and Africa jointly building the Belt and Road, we could provide new and strong impetus to China-Africa win-win cooperation and take this cooperation to a new level and enhance our comprehensive strategic and cooperative partnership.
That was Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking in Rwanda earlier this week about the Belt and Road Initiative and its prospects for Africa, a large focus of his trip to the continent this year. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to offer insights into Wang Yi's visit to Africa this year, as well as some of the larger implications for the continent, I have expert guests standing by. In Beijing, Hannah Wang Yi Ryder, she's the CEO of Development Reimagined. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyai, he's the co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Hannah Ryder, start with you first in Beijing, though China's foreign minister continued his more than 2-decade long tradition of making Africa the first official visit of any year. First, what is the significance to China of this tradition, and why is it important to start the year in that way?
Well, China has had this tradition for a long time. We've actually just recently done some analysis, which we'll be putting out tomorrow, about the visits that the Chinese high-level leadership from China have done to Africa over the last 10 years. It turns out that the Chinese government high-level leadership have made 79 trips to Africa over the last 10 years. So that's almost eight trips to different African countries per year, which is quite significant. Many of those countries are least developed countries. Africa has the largest number of least developed countries. But also they are countries with very different types of activity and levels of investment and political and different types of political arrangements. The Chinese government feels that Africa is a priority for them.
Yes, Chinese government feels that Africa is a priority for them and therefore attaches significance to these every year. Let me go to you in Johannesburg, though, Dr. Monyai. From Africa's perspective, though, how significant is this tradition that now has lasted over 2 decades?
Beijing has established itself as a friend of all seasons. And this it's a testimony to a continued tradition which really clearly demonstrate the strengthening of the relation between the continent and China. And as we see with each year, there are more investments, there are more developments. And this time around, particularly this juncture, one is expecting much more the talk of CPC's 19th Congress of new thinking within China and President Xi's theory, and to be really cemented, coupled with Africa's own Agenda 2063 and all what is happening within economic communities in all regions of the continent. There is a need for a consolidation of all these policies to ensure that there's a maximum outcome of this relationship.
Let's talk about that consolidation of the policies, because 3 years ago, of course, the FOCAC summit was held in Johannesburg. There were a raft of proposals that were put forward. China seems to have a plan of how it will operate with Africa. Does Africa have a plan?
Well, just to understand that what China is doing in Africa, we need to understand that China has 3 pillars around which it is arranging its partnership with Africa, and which Africa need to respond to effectively. First, it has shaped the environment within which this thing is taking place, meaning mutual respect, mutual accountability, win-win situation, and it is defining itself as against other former partners of Africa, either in the West or in the East. 2, China has put behind its words a heavy investment that is radically transforming the economies of Africa in a visible and palpable way. You cannot miss it. 3rd, China has put an architecture around which its relationship with Africa is being negotiated. Foremost of this is FOCAC, the most attended. In Johannesburg, 49 heads of state coming, the largest gathering of the African heads of state outside the African Union. Now, what that means is that Africa has a challenge, It needs to put a similar architecture. It needs to understand
Right.
what China means and what it is to seek to achieve. And it needs to redefine some of the agendas of Beijing, as Beijing is redefining its own agenda.
Hannah, Africa is still trying to define its agenda. Define for us how Beijing sees its partnership with Africa.
Yeah, well, I agree very much with what Professor Kagura has said, because actually I think China, FOCAC was initially a suggestion from the African side, and China agreed. But I think what has happened over the last 18 years, FOCAC turns 18 this year, is that the Chinese side has had to really set the agenda, and it's difficult to coordinate with so many African countries. You know, there's 54, well, now 52 that China formally coordinates with, and every country has a different perspective. So I think China has typically set the agenda at FOCAC, but I think, like the professor said, it's time for African countries to get together and actually define the agenda even more in their direction. They have got a lot from it so far, a lot of industrialization. Well, so far they've got a lot of structural investment, infrastructure, which has been very helpful. But African countries need to get even more investment. They need to get foreign direct investment. They need to get more industrialization from China, and hopefully that's what they can get from this FOCAC.
Right, Dr. Munyai, 54 countries at different levels of economic development. How does that engagement with China work out, though? How does it pan out? Because if you look back to 2015, the African Union was also a part of the FOCAC summit there. How does it work?
The challenge that African countries confront is that they agree at the AU in Addis Ababa to have a common position on key issues, and through the FACOC that is celebrating 18 years. But far beyond that, the real planning, real discussion and implementation of these policies and agreements, as a colleague from Beijing has mentioned, rightly so, it happens at a national state level. And therefore, in terms of coordination, what is happening at a member state as well as at AU, more often you find a lot of contradictions that states have, particular African states, most of them have short-term planning. It's a planning that is aligned to the head of state,
right,
the president, mainly towards elections in 5 years, while China has a much more longer term, and it looks into a horizon that AU and AU member states are not doing.
Let's look at terms of implementation, because in the last FOCAC, $60 billion was earmarked for the economic sectors, industrialization, agricultural modernization, infrastructure, people-to-people exchanges. In terms of implementation, though, of that, as we come up to the next FOCAC summit, where are we?
I think we first of all need to understand the dynamics that are governing China's intervention in Africa. China is very conscious that it is dealing with a continent that has a common identity, governed by perspectives of Pan-Africanism. At the same time, it is conscious that these are 54 countries with different agendas. So what it has done is to identify about 4 countries as what you could call pilot cases for the Silk Belt and Road initiative: Kenya, Tanzania, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And it is moving very fast on those. At the same time, Minister Wang's visit to Africa underscored that even countries outside the Belt and Road piloting are very, very important. Rwanda, Gabon, and others are also very important. Africa need to get China to invest more. We are told China is investing between 3% and 5% of its total global investment in Africa. Africa should work to get at least 10% of that Chinese investment onto the continent. By the time we hit 20%, we'll be ourselves a superpower. So it's upon Africa, I would argue, to basically deepen its relationship with China, because it's mutual. I am a critical scholar of Africa's relations with the rest of the world. And here, China has demonstrated that it has a goodwill. It has not hidden that it has interest in Africa. It's not a colonial power. It's not an imperial power. It is simply a natural partner for Africa.
Dr. Monyaya, is it upon Africa to deepen its relationship with China?
Indeed. I think especially now with the fast-changing global order, with the United States, with a president that looks at Africa and African people with a racist undertone, with the UK that is leaving the European Union, and a lot of disturbances in the Middle East and everywhere else, I think it is a golden opportunity for African countries to strengthen and deepen the relationship with China on key issues, on issues of education, and ensure that the volume of trade, it's not only coming from China to Africa, but also Africa increase its own volume into China, and particularly around the One Belt, One Road issue. More of Africa, more thinking is required. We have to work on our statistics to ensure that we record what we're talking about when it comes to development, and be serious in terms of what we do. Avoid wars, interstate wars, intrastate wars, and quite a number of other disturbing developments, such as possible conflict on the Horn of Africa around the Grand Inga Dam, should be avoided. And China has an advantage of being a friend to all African countries. It should increase its mediation as well as to prevent some of these unnecessary wars.
Hannah, there are two issues that the foreign minister spoke passionately about while he was on the continent. The FOCAC summit upcoming this year in Beijing was one of them, and the Belt and Road Initiative, in which many African countries have now shown interest in being a part of. What are the future priorities do you see China putting in front of Africa on these two fronts and in others?
I think both of them are quite aligned to each other. FOCAC will meet this year. The Belt and Road Summit will be in 2019. I think I fully agree with what the professor and the doctor have said in terms of both on the Chinese side, bringing in more African goods and services into China, and also into Africa, getting more investment in there. I hope those will be priorities for the Chinese government. And the first step will simply be providing information on a country-by-country basis on how that 60 billion has been distributed across the continent. I think that will be very helpful for African governments to be able to engage with, and for the Chinese government to really show what it has delivered to the rest of the world. This is an opportunity for the Chinese government to show that it is helping and working with the African continent, with countries which are extremely poor and require support in all sorts of ways, not just with aid. And the Chinese government is in a great place to do this. I hope it will do this year.
Right. I do want to get a political comment from all of you here, though, because the global political landscape has changed for Africa as well in terms of its partnerships with its traditional Western partners there. China remains focused on the South-South cooperation. How do you see, in your opinion, though, what has changed for Africa in terms of its partnership with China over the last 5 years, that these political partnerships are changing? And also, how do you think the international community is perceiving this friendship?
I think, first and foremost, China's entry into the world as a superpower has emboldened the continent's foreign policy, in the sense that now it has a choice. You can choose between China, Russia, and Western Europe. Just the presence of a choice is important. Two, Chinese policy, global policy, is very, very friendly. Soft power, mutual interest, win-win situations. This is what Africa is looking for as young countries. Thirdly, China has branded itself and marketed itself as a third world country that has developed. It is a developing country. It's inspiring the rest of the developing countries that it is possible to pull your population from abject poverty to only 4% within a short period. And therefore, us in Africa, we are looking to emulate China in terms of empowering our people. And that itself is enabling Africa to negotiate with the traditional bureaucracies like the World Bank and the IMF, which have prioritized what Africa should do rather than listening to what Africa is saying it should do. China is a good listener, and I think it is teaching the rest of the world on how to deal with Africa. We don't want to be talked to. We want to talk about what we want to do as a people. And that is basically what we are talking about, equity in the world, in terms of equal relations, mutual respect.
Right.
And that is what China is bringing onto the table.
Dr. Manyai, your thoughts?
In addition to what my brother has just said, I think China is also taking a leadership at a global level when it comes to globalization, and ensure that globalization benefits all. And beyond that, on question of environment, and all these factors do indeed affect our continent, the African continent. And therefore, I think there's a golden opportunity for China as well as Africa to really do much more study and understand each other. The languages, we have to understand each other, cultures, to avoid a situation where you have a superior and inferior relationship.
Hannah, you did mention earlier on that Chinese ministers have made, foreign ministers have made 79 trips to the continent in 10 years. The relationship has grown exponentially over that time. In your view, though, how do you see the international community now perceiving this partnership?
I think the international community, we've seen talk of concepts like sharp power and so on with regard to China's relationship with Western countries. So they continue, I believe, to be quite skeptical of China's influence and impact in the African continent. I guess in many ways in direct contrast to many Africans themselves. That said, I hope that there is a way of finding some commonality between those positions, and I hope more information shared about China's impact and analysed about China's impact in the African continent will help shift that perception.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you all for joining in on the program, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Beijing, Hannah Wang Yi, CEO of Development Reimagined. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyai, co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. And in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining in on Talk Africa. And remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.